Swadika, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. You're here with City Decoding and Transformation. Me, Guitar Sarudha Chusi, as your host. And as I mentioned earlier from our previous tip here that we also have a special guest that is from Broadway, Malyan, joining us for our special talk as well. For this type here, we are with Ed Baker, and he's based in Singapore. So let's hear that what he has a great information to share with all of us. So hand it over to Ed, please.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Sawadee Cup. It's a pleasure to be here today sharing my ideas. So I'm just going to share my screen to begin. So today I'm going to be talking under the title Future Cities, Transforming Lives and Communities through Urban Design. And to do that, I'm going to be talking about our experience globally, but more specifically within Asia Pacific. I'm going to be talking about the Singapore planning example, more specifically where I'm based and my primary experience. So to begin with, I'll just sort of give you an introduction to who I am. I'm a director of Broadway and Malyan. We're a global planning and architecture practice. I'm a practice principal and board director, and I have the title Global Head of Urbanism. So I work more specifically within the APAC region, but also globally as well. So what does urbanism mean? Urbanism covers different areas. We put it into two categories: cities and communities. So larger scale planning, new communities, urban design, and also urban spaces, which is more around public realm and landscape design. I'm based in Singapore, but I work globally with a focus on APAC and the Middle East, as I've just mentioned, and I have over 25 years experience. My academic background is quite a mixed one. I have a master's in urban design in landscape architecture, so I'm very interested in the public realm and the landscape. And I also have a first degree in human geography, which is really where my love of cities started in urban planning. So I'm sat here, we call the little red dot in Singapore, which is at sits here at the heart of the APAC region. My colleague Danny's just presented from the UK, and as a practice, we work globally in lots of different and interesting places, and I'm going to share with you some of those experiences. And like I've mentioned, I'll focus in on Singapore. So this is our studio. This is where I'm sat. On the wall here, you can see all the different places that we're working across the region and in the world. And on the wall, we have the slogan, creating places together. And that's primarily what we do. It's all about creating places. And wherever we work, it's always the key aspiration is how can we create something unique and special to that place. So just to give a little bit of a background, and I'm calling this the context, and this is urban disruption. So this is the background to all the work that we're doing and the projects that we're doing. And so what do I mean by urban disruption? It's all the change that is happening in our lives, in our cities. So as cities are growing and changing, in the background, obviously, we've just had COVID, which is ongoing, the global pandemic. On here, actually, it doesn't have war. We've got wars like Ukraine at the moment. We've got all these other changes like climate change, which is obviously really having a massive impact on the places that we're living and how we need to plan. And also we've got certain trends like changing demographics in Singapore. We have an aging population. People are living longer. And so as people live longer, it's a change in demographics. So how do we plan and create places for these new demographics? And I think there's other general trends in the background, like the digital transformation, which is really changing cities, the way that we live in cities, the way that we work in cities. And so how can we plan places in this context? So in response to that change and that disruption, this is just some of the places and projects that we're working on. I'm calling this the response to the design changes. So the work that we do is of a real sort of varied type of work, and we work at a real range of scales as well. So from very large scale city planning, metropolitan planning, cities like Bangkok, how do you plan at that scale, at the regional scale? So in Thailand, you have the regional scale, things like the UEC corridor, how do you start to plan places of that more regional scale? And then we zoom down to more the districts, the neighborhoods, the communities that people are living and working in, down to the neighborhoods, the campuses, the resorts, and then down to that very micro scale, the buildings, the places, the streets. And so as planners and designers, we always think in this scale, and quite often the types of work that we're doing is at these different scales. So what I've done is I've tried to split our work into some key themes and categories. And so the first thing I'm going to talk about is connected cities. And so a lot of our work is about mobility. How do you connect cities together? This is a city in Africa called Luanda, where we worked on the large scale city plan. And so a very large scale project, but how do you start to plan an existing city? It considers things like the expansion of the city. How do you integrate people, new communities, new housing, more affordable housing, and how do you bring it together? So at this scale, we're preparing land use plans, but primarily the main driver for this is about connectivity. It's about public transport, the railways, the high-speed rail, the airports, the metro lines, the cycle paths, how people are moving. And if you understand how people are moving, then we can start to plan the centres. And so this is what we call a large-scale city plan, a land use plan, and you can start to see the hotter colours there, the more commercial centres, the sub-centres, and then the residential districts around that. We also look at transit and mobility, and so this is another project in Africa working with the World Bank, and it's a corridor for a bus rapid transit system. It could be a metro corridor. How do we start to plan for the stations and the communities along these corridors? So how can we coordinate the land uses with the transit planning? And so this is very typical of the type of work that we're doing within the region globally. And I think it's very relevant to Thailand as you look to expand your public transport networks, cities like Thailand, which are invested in metros, the high-speed rails, and how can you better plan communities around this and what we call transit-orientated development. So when we look at the stations and we talk about planning around stations, how do we create more compact development around the stations, and how do we start to connect and better plan our cities? So a lot of our work is about planning. In this case, this is around a bus rapid transit station, but it could be a metro station, and how we can start to connect this into the city. And probably more significantly, how can we really, make this to the advantage of the communities around it, and how can this be a driver for change? And so a lot of our work is about making the most of the mobility and connecting communities, connecting people to jobs, connecting people's homes to jobs and the city, and making their lives more livable. And so actually we're working at the moment in Thailand. This is a TOD planning around a transit station in Bang Wah. It's a project funded through the UK government, but we're working with the Bangkok Metropolitan Authority on this project. And this is what we're calling an equitable TOD. So how can you, it's not about me as a planner looking down on a city and top-down planning. It's about planning with communities. It's about, listening to people and the communities. How can you plan these places? So I can produce a nice plan, but really that should be shaped by the communities and the people, the local schools, the local residents, the temples, the universities, and these are the people which will ultimately shape the city. And so how can we plan places that are inclusive and more livable as a result of it? And so how can we start to, through this, then start to visualize the city? And if you plan train stations, you want to make it more compact. You want to have more people living close to the stations. So there's an opportunity for height and density. And how can we start to create communities? But in going tall and high, like you do in cities like Bangkok, how can you make sure that you plan at the ground level? You make sure that they're grounded in the community. How can you make sure that you make them, you respect the existing context, the existing places, the heritage and the soul of the place, not just create, new development that just feels like it's just landed. It has to be rooted in the environment. And so this is an image here that starts to show how we could start to go a little bit taller in terms of the planning, but how can we still plan, and integrate the waterways, public spaces, the temples, the community uses, and also looking at how we call it land value capture, but how can you look at the opportunity from the station to actually start providing public services as well, and using some of the land uplift from the station to fund things like affordable housing and more community uses. And so this is just another view here where you can start to see, you know, that sort of ground level. And this is, you know, the network of canals that you have in Bangkok and how you can start to plan around those canals and integrate them, the developments within the city. And we also talk about new mobility. So that's really about the other forms of transport, you know, cycling. There's a big global cycling movement. So how can we integrate cycling within the city? New forms of transport, autonomous transport. How can we make it more pedestrian friendly, safe for people, you know, more accessible, universally accessible for people with disabilities, and how people can move. And I think in places like Bangkok, it's particularly important that you design to the climate as well. You know, how can you cool the environment, reduce the urban heat environment, reduce the pollution, and make more pleasant places to live. So future economies, a lot of the work that we do is about designing for new industries, new economies. And when we talk about, you know, post-COVID, how places can respond back, a lot of it's about, you know, creating jobs. And so a lot of our work is around, you know, the new technologies, the new industries of the future, and how can we plan and integrate these workplaces in the city. We've experienced, you know, working from home, you know, and what does that mean for our cities and the places that we create. And so in places like Australia, you know, this is what we call a knowledge precinct, where we're planning a new innovation district. It's connected into the university, it's connected into healthcare and new types of industries, and how we create an innovation park. So it includes things like data centers, but it's also got all the community uses that create a place. And this is in Brisbane in Australia. And how do you bring these uses together to create this, what we call an ecosystem, the knowledge ecosystem? So the universities are providing the people, the staff, they're going to be able to do these new, you know, there's no point to attract talent and businesses, you need to train people. So that's a really important part of the work that we do in creating places. Obviously in the changing world, you know, e-commerce and logistics is very important, you know, places, you know, as we're online shopping, we need more distribution centers. So a lot of our work is around creating places. It's not just about big boxes on the edge of city, but quite often these are distribution centers within cities, you know, within urban environments. So how can we plan and integrate them within places? This is a project in Malaysia. And as we talk about, you know, coming back to the workplace, how do we attract people back into the city, back to the offices, how we make them safer, healthy environments? And I think one thing that we always talk about a lot is about indoor, outdoor experiences. So not just planning, you know, this is a business park in Jakarta where it's the real focus is on outdoor spaces, you know, shaded spaces, the cafes and that environment that makes it more attractive to work and be in. And these are healthier places as well, and planning spaces that can be used for events. This is actually HSBC's office in Jakarta, but how the spaces can be used for events. And this is for a big sort of yoga and outdoor fitness events. But this is an important part of the planning when we create new business communities. So that sort of leads into really healthy communities. And what do I mean by healthy communities? Well, healthy communities can be about creating better healthcare. You know, it's about more hospitals, it's about more community healthcare. It's about planning for, I mentioned earlier about an aging population, you know, how can you create more care within the community? And I think during COVID, obviously this is very important, you know, it's about the bigger hospitals, but about creating, you know, more healthcare close to people's homes and in the community. And how do we allow people to still live at home, but have access to quality healthcare and treatment? And it's also about, you know, how we just create, you know, things like urban farming and agriculture. Obviously in Thailand, you know, you've got a very big, large agriculture economy, but, you know, within the cities as well. And, you know, we do a lot of work around integrating urban farming. And this is actually in the Middle East, but it's a urban farm at the heart of a new community. It's villas, but it becomes an important focal point for the community. So integrating sort of urban agriculture, you know, giving people access to be able to grow food. And I think this is quite relevant actually for you know, under the theme of an aging population, you know, for an older population, it keeps people active, it brings people together. And so it becomes increasingly an element that we plan for. And then I've called it sort of agri-tech really, which relates to that as well. Urban farming and how can you get more and how you plan in the city. So a lot of vertical farms, and this is something that cities like Singapore, where they land scarce, are spending a lot of time and research into how to create more urban farming and denser, towers of farming, more, how can you create more diverse crops and how can you feed your urban population? And it's also just about, I talked about earlier about, the cycle paths and the pedestrian trails. And, during COVID, we all wanted access to public spaces and, exercise. And it's, really as part of building back better. This is very important part of the planning in cities. So designing with nature, designing in nature is, very important. This relates to, we call it nature-based solutions, but green infrastructure. And I think in Thailand, you're increasingly seeing more and more of this. How can you manage your water in a green way? And so a lot of our work within the region and in Singapore is around green infrastructure, managing the water sustainably. And this is a project that we're working in the Philippines, actually, in integrating a large new city park, but it's got a big water basin, which helps manage the water in the city in a sustainable way. It's also a home for wildlife and biodiversity and becomes an important part of the city planning. And also, that integrated nature. So it's about, respecting the existing nature when you plan a community and how can you enhance that biodiversity. And this goes hand in hand with, managing the water, cooling the climate and creating more interesting places as well and giving people access to nature. And again, during COVID, people in the city, you need these spaces and plan these spaces of release. And then the very practical aspect of just planning green infrastructure within roads and, making cities greener. And we call this the sort of sponge cities, literally how can you make cities greener and allow the water to be managed and recycled rather than just hard spaces. And this is very relevant in cities like Bangkok, where you have issues with flooding. As you build more and more urban development, you need to make sure that you plan greener development, and managing water is a really important aspect. So inclusive cities, obviously, we want to plan places that are inclusive, involve all the communities, different people of different ages, different groups of people. And so, this is one of the big themes of a lot of our projects is about, regeneration and adaptive reuse. And this is a mixed use community in Canada that we've been planning over the last 10 years, and it's been slowly built out. And how can we use some of the existing buildings, which is better for the environment? To reuse things is better than building new. And how can we create the spaces? And so we call this sort of adaptive reuse. And this is an old, you can see it's an old old factory there that's been turned into a cafe and an art space in the city. And affordable housing, how can we create lots of different homes for different people? That's not just about towers, but it's about townhouses, it's about gardens, and how can we integrate this within the city so we're not creating enclaves and ghettos. So I talked earlier about planning around public transport. How can we create people closer to jobs and give people access to jobs? And I think it's something that, again, during COVID, we've thought a lot about our spaces, our immediate spaces. There's the public parks, but also smaller spaces, and how can we plan affordable homes with gardens and places where children can play, and how can we create inclusive communities? And so this is an example this is in Indonesia, where actually we're looking at a regeneration project, and this is a former red light district. And so this is looking at how to regenerate the area, looking at different types of economies, promoting regeneration through new economies. So this is looking at creative economies, education, and how can we change a place? So it's not just about making it look nicer and better, but you have to create new jobs, and that's all part of this regeneration and reuse. So using things like the heritage, culture, health and safety, and the arts and creativities as drivers for change in these projects. And you can start to see here, you have some of the existing streets are being transformed through the placemaking and new types of businesses. So this is actually a business center, a new business center for co-working, but also how it can, using elements like tourism to really change the area. So this is an ongoing project and a very interesting regeneration project, which I think could be very relevant to different parts of Bangkok as well and different parts of the city. So it's not just about building nice new towers and new towns with villas. It's also about regenerating the existing city. So now I'm going to move on. So this is sort of a general approach with a bit more of an Asian focus, but now I'm going to talk a little bit about Singapore, just to finish off really in our Singapore experience. So this is where I'm sat. Singapore is a very unique approach to planning, and it touches on a lot of the themes that I've been talking about. In terms of an area, it's a small island, but with that, it's had to think a lot harder about how it plans its city. So I think that this disadvantage of being a smaller space and place has then been turned on its head. And so the planning has to be innovative. So how can you plan, more with less, basically? And so that's sort of driven the whole approach to Singaporean planning. And the population has grown. It's quite a dense place. So, it's famous for its high-rise towers and higher density living and working. And it's also got sort of some of the demographics I've talked about. It's got an aging population. And so one of the key things that the planners in Singapore are thinking about is how to plan for this population. And that's about the healthcare, it's about the housing, it's about making sure places are, cities are safer. Just simple things like, planning crossings on roads that wait a little bit longer to give people more time to cross the roads, making sure that people, if you're in a wheelchair or, you're less able to walk, you can actually move through a city. But the other thing about Singapore is actually, it's about really sort of building and using the land that you've got, but what it allows is, it builds higher density. So this is some of the housing development. 81% of Singaporeans live in HDB flats, this higher density living, which is a very large percentage of the population, but you can plan taller, but how do you create a quality of life as well? And I think the key thing is that in Singapore, open spaces, they call it the garden city. It's driven through its open spaces and its greenery, which makes Singapore quite famous in terms of its planning. And its new approach is called the city in nature. So it's not just about gardens anymore. It's about how can you integrate, this higher density city within nature. So 46.5% of Singapore is green, which is amazing, really, considering it's a small island. And so how can you plan more with less, as I mentioned earlier? And I think the key thing is it has a very high GDP. So you need to create jobs. And so one of the primary drivers of Singapore is always about, creating new jobs, creating jobs for Singaporeans, but also how can you attract talent? How can you make it a hub within the region? For technology companies, how can you attract businesses to be here who will then create jobs for? So a key part of, I talked about our work earlier being around this, but is really planning for these new economies and new jobs. And I think that's very relevant for Thailand. I know Thailand 4.0, as you want to attract more innovation, more technology companies. How do you do that and drive these new economies? So the planning in very simple terms is, you've got the constraints of the land and the sea. And so how can you combine the environmental side, the economic and the social, to create, this great city to live, work and play? And this is the planning in Singapore in one simple slide. And so they have what they call a 50-year concept plan, which is a long-term plan for the city, a bit like the one I shared in Africa, which is about land use, it's about transportation, it's about open spaces, and how can you plan more city, more room for growth, how can you create the economies? And at the moment, this last year and this year, they've opened up the consultation to the whole of Singapore and broader, and it's called a long-term review. They're reviewing this 50-year plan. So where does Singapore go in the future? And they've called it Space for Our Dreams. And so they've held these consultation sessions online, and now they're broadening it and getting lots of ideas on how Singapore should be planned in the future. And I think this is a great model of, how to use technology to engage people. Lots of different people from different backgrounds with different skills are able to then contribute to where they think Singapore might go in terms of jobs and housing and transport. And so the key themes of this are future environment, future living, future of work, and future mobility. And people have been sharing their views on their concerns for Singapore, rising sea level, urban heat island. How can we create a more diverse Singapore and create a place for different people? And how can they sustain a quality of life, as the population increases and more people are living here? How can we make sure that people, have a quality of life? And so when we talk about more specifically about some of the work that we're doing, I talked about the new economies, and one of the bits of work that we've been doing recently is working with JTC, which is the government organization for promoting industry across Singapore. So their job is to create places for these new industries, for new jobs, how to attract companies to come and be based in Singapore. And then the key thing is about centers. So it's not just about planning the center of your city, it's about decentralization and creating these new hubs for growth and planning. So all the innovation parks, the different business centers. So you have your financial center, but also I think during COVID, one of the key trends is how can you take jobs closer to people's homes? So you're starting to see this new planning, and this helps take the heat out of the city. It helps with the transport planning. It helps with the congested city. So you create these centers, but also about but they need to be connected. So you have to bring them closer to people's jobs. You have to create public transport. You have to connect them to cycleways. And so the work that we've been doing is about new industries. And this specific bit of work has been around promoting industry in the city. So it's been about promoting a making economy in the city, about so it's not just about, technology and digital companies, but it's also about, businesses, making things, manufacturing, and how can you accommodate that within the city as well? And so how can you be living near some of these industries? And I think it's a very interesting idea about how can you live and work, and this is all part of creating a vibrant city. And I think for cities like Bangkok, which thrive on this vibrancy and naturally have a very creative population who make things and manufacturing things, and how can you create more spaces for this within the city? So this bit of work was, it was called Singapore Makers Land, and it was around how to promote, making in Singapore within the city. And it was all about factories of the future, new types of industries, and promoting places. And so it relates to some different themes. It's about training people, upskilling people, so we talked about that aging population. It's not just about young people, it's about how can we retrain older people for these new jobs as well. So that's a key part of the work. So it's about education. Another key theme of this project was about adaptive reuse and the circular economy, about recycling things. How can businesses share more things together? So they're using less resources. How can you share maybe bits of the manufacturing process together? And this starts to create these new sort of typologies for businesses in the city. These new making environments. And so being in Singapore, it's still got towers, it's still higher density. This is planned around the metro station. So you've got access to the public transport, but it's also got cycleways. And how can you then plan maybe homes, but nearer to some of these spaces? So very interesting and different approach to planning in the city and new industries. And also it's about, communities as well, so that community bit, all the bits I've talked about earlier, because the area that, quite often, in this specific area, there's quite a lot of, there's lots of communities around these industrial areas, and how can you make them feel part of these communities, feel part, and these people could be your potential workers as well. So it's about training the local communities, creating places that connect as well into the city. And so the other theme I'm going to sort of touch on in Singapore, so I've talked about the new economies, also about health. So this is specifically about COVID, and Singapore is, carefully managed COVID. I think you've got perhaps some of the European countries like like the United Kingdom or the Scandinavian countries that really opened up very quickly. Singapore's not, not quite Hong Kong in terms of its constraints. It's somewhere in the middle, and they've sort of tried to carefully open up. So actually, we're allowed to go outside without masks now, but a lot of it has been about how to manage, this response. And green spaces has had a really important part of this. This response to the city and investment in green infrastructure. This is a robot dog actually, which was going around telling people to wear their masks and keep socially distant apart. So the smart city, which is an important part of the work as well, and technology in the city. So in Singapore, there is a master plan. So there's the land use plan and the city plan that I talked about, also a plan for healthcare. This is about building more hospitals, more community hospitals, more clinics closer to people's homes. But it's also about what they call the level of care. So you create the hospitals, you create the nursing homes, the assisted living, but also a key part of that is disease prevention. So as planners, it's about how can we keep people out of hospitals? How can we, make people healthier through city planning? And that's where the cycle paths, the open spaces, promoting healthier eating. The healthy lifestyle is a really important part of that care, that model of care as well. And so within that, Singapore has this healthy living master plan, it calls it, which is about promoting sports. It's about, access to football pitches and playgrounds, running trails, but also it's about access to, quality food. And this is as important as the, prevention is important as the provision of the hospitals and the big healthcare infrastructure. So really it's about, as places recover, it's about promoting that healthy lifestyle, disease prevention. And so within Singapore, there's been a big investment in things like the Park Connector network, which is now a network of cycle trails across the island, and eventually they're going to connect all the way around Singapore. And so during COVID and Singapore's been locked down, this has been an escape for the city, and cycling has just boomed. It's huge, and I know it's got bigger in Thailand as well, but it's such a quick planning win, I think, to create more spaces for people to be healthier and keep active. So it's about the new parks and the innovative green spaces. This is one called the Green Corridor, which is near where I live. Actually, if you know Singapore, it's near the Botanical Gardens. And it's the old railway line that's been converted into a cycle and pedestrian corridor. And so people can move through the city. And then so just to come back around really to where I started from, talking about the importance of public transport and trains, in Singapore, the 15-minute, the 20-minute city. So you have the public transport, the stations, but also how can we create more neighborhood centers and allow people, which are walkable, and so people can access the public services, the local healthcare and the retail and all the things that we want close to our homes, but also how you can then connect into the city and to the city centre. So it's also about these the 20-minute towns, the immediate things, and then the 40-minute cities are those things that are a little bit further away. So maybe some of the bigger shopping centres, some of the bigger things like libraries or bigger schools. And so how can you plan, more integrated transport hubs, but also how can you more cycle paths? Obviously, technology has really changed public transport. And then, just some projects that bring that together. This is a project we've been working on, which is a new hospital expansion in Singapore. So it includes, healthcare, it includes education, but more importantly, it's about how to connect that into the wider community. It's got public and private healthcare. It's got, nearby there's hotels as well. So it's healthcare tourism is part of the story, but this is planned and connected into the metro system. So it's connected into the train station so people can access it and the public can access it. And just some of the innovative community planning. So vertical community planning in Singapore. This is a new community centre. It's got food gardens, it's got healthcare, it's got shopping, it's got some education, it's got care, elderly care facilities. This is beside the metro station, and it's a kampong is what we call a village in Singapore. It's a vertical kampong, So it takes that traditional way of living and lifestyle, and it takes it into a vertical element, and then brings it all together in this sort of integrated.
Yes, you're actually doing a wonderful job here and managing your time as well.
So I don't know if there's any sort of specific questions, but I thought that maybe, you know, there's some of the sort of common, I mean, sort of, what do I think the, you know, the success factors are really, you know, if there's some real key takeaways for this. And I think that, you know, planning doesn't have to be complicated, you know, and I think that quite often, you know, in the past, there's been some mistakes made, you know, we've been too car orientated, and Danny in the previous presentation talked about this, you know, how just some simple lessons for planning, you know, how we can plan land uses, how we can plan around public transport, how we can integrate, you know, and plan with people, you know, bottom up planning rather than top down planning, and how can we just make cities more livable and lovable, and you know, better places to be around, and these are the sort of places that will then attract people to be in, and they will attract the talent, which will then become the people. All cities are competing at the moment for good people. They want to train people, and you know, for new, you know, and to track the technology companies, you know. So for example, in Singapore, Dyson have just moved here and they've opened up their HQ here. But to do that is a really big move. You know, you have to provide the right business conditions, the right places for them to work, you know, the factories and the office spaces. But more importantly, you need to create the people and the talent, you know, for these businesses.
It's very nice what you're sharing right now. But I was just wondering, then after all of this, what do you think about the word sustainability? How do we make it sustain in the future?
I think, I mean, I've touched on, I think everything I've talked about is sustainable. You know, sustainable planning is about, you know, trying to keep people out of cars, you know, to use public transport, which is cleaner and greener. You know, cycling is clean and green. You know, you reduce air pollution. You know, it reduces carbon. It makes people healthier. You know, it keeps people out of, you know, hospitals. I think also, you know, sustainability is about, you know, inclusive communities as well. You know, the economics and making places that, you know, where we plan for everyone. And I think I use that word with the project in Bangkok we've been doing around the TOD, about how to create an inclusive development, transit-oriented development, because it's easy to create, you know, more condos for people with money, but you need to provide and create places for everybody. And I think that's makes a more sustainable city in the long run as well. And I think the other aspect I talked about which is very important, which is about adaptive reuse and recycling. And so as architects, we want to build new buildings, but really we should be thinking harder about how we can make better use of the existing city. And I know in Thailand, increasingly, you know, there's fantastic examples of old buildings that have been reused. And I think there should be more of that happening in cities, and, you know, new spaces that can be used again. And actually, the construction industry uses a lot of energy. It's actually very unsustainable.
Yes, I know.
So how can we make it more sustainable? And I think that's a really important part of the work that we do, is how to, you know, not just creating more and more stuff and more things to build, but, you know, doing
not just the building.
Yeah, exactly. Doing more with less. And I think that nature-based approach as well is very important, because actually we can learn a lot of lessons from nature, and quite often that is the most sustainable approach anyway. You know, we don't always need lots of hard engineering and big water channels, but we can actually plan, you know, green spaces that do the same job as well. So I think that's an important part.
Yes, I totally agree. And I heard you mention the word like making out the most, you know, and, you know, communicating a lot with the locals, you know, and really find what they really need, you know.
Yeah, I mean, Danny talked about this in his presentation. You know, really, it's hard, you know, as a planner, and particularly as you're talking about, you know, I'm sat in Singapore and I go and do a project in, I don't know, in the Middle East. You know, you're planning in a community, and you really need to, that top-down planning is gone. You know, it really, we talk a lot about more bottom-up planning, working with communities and consultation. You know, the sort of work we've been doing in Bangkok, where, you know, speaking to people to shape that community rather than me saying what I think is you need, you know, a big tower or a new school, or I think, you know, this is what you need. When really people, you know, the communities and people who are going to be living there, or the future population as well. You know, there's people who we're planning for in the future. What do they want?
Yes, that's true. So maybe our last questions for this moment here, just an ending point for you to share your personal opinion. What do you think about the future for urban development?
I think that I mean, I think I shared with you the sessions that were held in Singapore on
yes.
You know, where Singapore is going in the future. And so they've had this big public consultation, and so there's been all these different ideas coming in. I think some of the main concerns, I mean, I think we're all concerned about climate change.
True.
And I think that, you know, what we do as planners has to be driven as a response to that. And I think we play a really important role, as mentioned, about, you know, how the built environment is, you know, essentially quite unsustainable. And so how can we create places that are greener? And I feel that that has to be a major driver for the future of cities. And that covers everything I've been talking about, really. Because quite often, you know, the places that are on the fringe, you know, as sea levels rise and flooding, and cities like Jakarta and Bangkok, you know, these are the big challenges that we have to deal with now. And I think planners, and then the other bit, I suppose, just in general, is, you know, how we can create more inclusive places, because, you know, all the city, you know, world is urbanizing and cities are growing, and how can we make sure that we don't leave people behind and make people part of that planning, I think, is probably the other really key aspect, I think, going forward, because it's easy to create lots of shiny condos and big shopping malls that you know, people can't afford, etc. So I think we really need to, without stating the obvious, but for me in the future, I think that's a key part. And I think people are worried as well, you know, how as more people move to the cities, what does it mean for them, you know, and, you know, do they get left behind? They can't afford to live in the cities, they can't afford housing. And I think if you want cities to be vibrant and livable, and you want people to do these jobs in the future, you need to create places for everyone.
Yes, I truly agree with you too. That was wonderful, and thank you very much for sharing with us here. Ed, all the way from, he's based in Singapore here, also from Broadway, Malyan here. Thank you once again. And ladies and gentlemen, well, please stay tuned with us. There's still more coming up with the city decoding and transformation here. A lot of our guest speakers are professionals in this way here that are more than happy to join us. And you can also share experience, a lot of information that has been sharing. We thank you very much once again, Ed, for joining us. ขอบคุณค่ะ
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.